Don't you dare sign my name to that. Colonel, this doesn't need to get physical. I called them as a precaution. A precaution for what? For when you found out. Sign it, and everyone in this room still walks away like colleagues. Colonel, step back from the desk. Read what's inside first, then tell me to step back. This says voluntary medical retirement, Foster. The evaluation's attached. Dr. Halvern signed off 3 weeks ago. I've never met a Dr. Halvern in my life. Paperwork gets backdated. It happens all the time. Not paperwork with a forged signature on it. Whose handwriting is this? Careful, Graham. Think about Rhett. This goes easier on both of you without a scene in front of your own men.
Something in Ashcroft went cold that had nothing to do with the folder. Did you just threaten my son to get me to sign my own forged discharge? I'm telling you how this ends badly, for everyone. Then explain that to the Inspector General. Ashcroft tucked the folder under his arm and looked at both MPs. Touch me again, and this report explains exactly why you were standing here. Neither of them moved to stop him. You're making a mistake, Graham. The only mistake in this room, Ashcroft said, was thinking a threat against my son would make me sign faster. He walked out past the MPs without waiting for a response. The folder gripped hard enough to crease the edges and didn't slow his pace until he reached his own office 2 buildings over. Colonel Graham Ashcroft was 54, commander of a logistics battalion at Fort Callison, once quietly discussed as a strong candidate for his first star before his wife died 5 years earlier. Since then, senior officers who'd once praised his judgment had started praising his patience instead, a word that in the officer corps meant something closer to sidelined. He raised his son alone and had never let the whispers about it change how he ran his unit. Red Ashcroft was 14, watchful, and had grown up on post treating the base like a backyard. His one obsession was amateur radio, a homemade antenna off the carport, and a scanner he'd saved 2 years of allowance to buy. He never traded on his father's rank, a fact the other kids on post noticed more than he ever let on that he had. Foster Blaine had served as Ashcroft's executive officer for 9 years, close enough that he'd once sat with Red in a hospital waiting room the night Ashcroft's wife died, holding the boy steady because Ashcroft's own hands couldn't. That history was exactly what made the forged date on the discharge feel less like an error and more like a wound Ashcroft hadn't found the bottom of yet. He didn't sleep that night. He sat at his kitchen table with the folder open, running his thumb along the forged signature, and by morning he'd decided one thing with total clarity. Whatever Blaine had done, he intended to find out exactly how far it went. He filed the complaint with the Inspector General's office the next morning himself, in person, refusing to route it through the battalion's own administrative chain where Blaine still held influence over which documents moved quickly and which quietly stalled. The IG investigator assigned to the case, a methodical major from division headquarters, read the discharge folder twice before asking the question Ashcroft had been waiting for. You said you've never met a Dr. Halvern. Never heard the name before yesterday. There's a Dr. Halvern registered with the Regional Medical Command, the major said, sliding a printout across the table. Retired 18 months ago. His signature stamp was reported missing from his old office around the same time. Nobody ever filed a theft report because nobody noticed it was gone. Ashcroft studied the printout, the neat blue ink of a signature he'd never seen, attached to an evaluation he'd never sat through. So the medical basis for my discharge is a stolen stamp and a name pulled off a retirement roster. That's what it looks like from here. I need to be direct with you, Colonel. An investigation like this moves slowly by design, so it can't be challenged later on procedural grounds. I understand that's not what you want to hear. I don't need it fast, Ashcroft said. I need it thorough. Whoever built this expected me to be too embarrassed by a fake medical discharge to fight it in the open. They miscalculated. The major closed the folder and studied Ashcroft for a moment before speaking again. Most officers in your position would have quietly signed the countersignature themselves rather than let a psychiatric discharge become public record, forged or not. There's no shame attached to it on paper, but there's always talk. Let them talk, Ashcroft said. I'd rather have every officer on this post whispering about a scandal that's true than sign my name to a lie because I was afraid of the whispering. That's not the answer most men give me. Most men haven't had 9 years to learn exactly how much a signature is supposed to mean before somebody decided mine was available to forge. The major studied him a moment longer, the kind of look Ashcroft recognized from years of evaluating soldiers under pressure, weighing whether the composure in front of him was genuine or simply well-rehearsed. "For what it's worth, Colonel, most of the men I investigate spend our first meeting telling me why the paperwork doesn't matter. You spent it telling me why it does. That's usually the difference between a case that goes somewhere and one that quietly dies on somebody's desk. Then make sure this one doesn't die on a desk." "That's not up to me alone anymore," the major said. "It's up to how much you're willing to keep pushing after today, because cases like this have a way of losing momentum the moment the person who filed the complaint decides it's easier to let the Army handle it quietly. Most don't push. You strike me as someone who will." He returned to his own headquarters that afternoon and found Blaine waiting outside his office, arms crossed, wearing the careful, contained posture of a man rehearsing a version of events he hadn't finished believing himself. "The IG called me in for a preliminary interview," Blaine said. "I want you to know I answered every question honestly." "Did you?" "I told them I countersigned the discharge packet based on paperwork that came across my desk, already completed." "I didn't build the packet, Graham. I processed it. Somebody built it. Somebody who knew my movement schedule well enough to backdate it to a day I couldn't possibly contest, and knew this battalion's administrative workflow well enough to get a stolen signature stamp past 3 layers of review." Ashcroft studied his friend's face, searching for the tell he'd learned to read across 9 years of shared command decisions, and found nothing but a careful, practiced stillness. "That's not a stranger's work, Foster. That's somebody who has access to exactly what you have access to. You think I did this? I think you're the only person in this building who benefits from me being gone before the readiness audit closes next month." Ashcroft let that sit in the air between them. "I haven't accused you of anything yet. I'm telling you what the evidence is going to say, so you have the chance to get ahead of it while that's still an option." Blaine's composure held for exactly as long as it took him to walk away down the hallway, and Ashcroft watched him go, noting, with a dread he didn't yet have words for, that his old friend hadn't denied the accusation outright even once. The break that actually cracked the case open didn't come from anyone looking for it. Rhett had caught strange chatter on his scanner twice before and written it off as the same bleed through his antenna, sometimes picked up off a repeater tower near the motor pool, a quirk he'd once complained about to the one adult on post who actually understood radios. That adult was Specialist Callan Reeve, 20 years old, 6 months out of communications school, who'd spent an afternoon that spring helping Rhett chase down the interference and had come away oddly impressed by how precisely the kid logged frequencies nobody official had ever asked him to log. 3 nights after the discharge folder landed on Ashcroft's desk, Rhett caught the chatter a 3rd time and wrote down everything he could make out. A time, 2 voices, a phrase repeated twice. Same 4 crates, don't log it till morning. He brought the page to Reeve the next morning, more curious than alarmed. "Same frequency as before?" Reeve asked, turning the page over. "Same spot on the dial, same time of night, almost exactly." Rhett tapped the numbers he'd written down. "It's not supposed to carry that far. That's what you told me." "It's not," Reeve said slowly. "Which means either your antenna's doing something it shouldn't, or somebody's transmitting a lot closer to that leak point than they realize." Reeve pulled the maintenance frequency's actual traffic for that exact window that afternoon, off-duty, on a hunch a 14-year-old's notebook had made feel a lot less far-fetched than it should have. The traffic was there. Convoy movement logged as a training run, the vehicles never once appearing on the next morning's readiness report. Reeve found Ashcroft's office through the battalion adjutant that same evening, formal and visibly nervous, Rhett's notebook page and a single printed transmission record held against their chest like something that might be taken away before they finished explaining it. "Sir, I know this isn't really my lane to be bringing things to you directly. It isn't even really mine. Your son caught it first, on his own scanner. Tell me anyway. There's a transmission pattern on one of the maintenance frequencies. Late-night convoy traffic, logged as a training movement, but the vehicles never show up on the next day's readiness report." Reeve set the page down. "Rhett's antenna has been bleeding into it for weeks without either of us realizing what we were actually hearing. I only checked the one night so far. I don't know how far back it goes." Ashcroft looked over the single page, the pattern unmistakable, even from one night's traffic laid beside a readiness report it flatly contradicted. "Then let's find out how far back it goes." "It matters," Ashcroft said. "You took a 14-year-old's notebook seriously instead of writing it off as static. Most people wouldn't have." Reeve had grown up 2 towns over from Post, the first in their family to enlist, and had spent the first 6 months of their assignment handed the least interesting tasks in the commo shop, the kind of work senior soldiers assigned junior ones, without much thought about whether they'd actually notice anything the assignment wasn't designed to catch. Reeve had noticed anyway, that afternoon, because a kid's careful handwriting had been harder to dismiss than static usually was. Most officers wouldn't have believed a civilian-dependent scanner notes, Ashcroft said. What made you look twice? Honestly, sir, at first I almost didn't, Reeve admitted. But he'd written down exact times, not just sometime around midnight. People padding a story don't usually bother being that precise. That precision just cracked open a fraud case, Ashcroft said. Don't let anyone talk either of you out of trusting it again. Reeve hesitated at the door on the way out, the way soldiers did when they had one more thing to say and weren't sure their rank entitled them to say it. Sir, can I ask you something? Why'd you believe this so fast? Most officers would have wanted 3 sergeants to confirm it first. Because you and my son brought me a real recording and exact times instead of a theory, Ashcroft said. Theories are cheap. I've been in this uniform long enough to know the difference between someone telling me what they think I want to hear and someone telling me what they actually heard, whether or not it's convenient. I wasn't sure it would matter to anyone above a sergeant. It matters to me specifically because nobody above a sergeant bothered to look, Ashcroft said. That's not a compliment to this battalion. That's a problem I intend to fix once we're done with the larger one. Before taking it any further, Ashcroft had Reeve pull the archive traffic on that frequency, going back as far as records allowed, unwilling to move forward on a report he hadn't verified with his own eyes the way he verified everything else that crossed his desk. Explain this like I've never read a frequency log in my life, Ashcroft said. Every legitimate movement gets logged twice, Reeve said, pulling up a side-by-side comparison on a laptop screen. Once on the maintenance frequency when the convoy actually rolls, and once on the readiness report the next morning. These entries only ever show up on the first log. They never make it to the second one. Whoever's running them knows exactly which record gets audited and which one doesn't. That's not a mistake. That's someone who understands this battalion's paperwork better than most officers who've served here twice as long. How far back does the archive go? As far as records are kept, sir. 3 years almost to the month. Same pattern the whole way through. Different dates. 3 years, Ashcroft repeated. I've commanded this battalion for exactly 3 years. Whoever started this didn't wait for an opening. They started the week I took the guide on. That's what worried me most, Reeve admitted. It's not sloppy. It's careful. Careful is harder to catch. Ashcroft closed the laptop and sat back, turning the implication over. A careless thief eventually got caught by his own carelessness. A careful one only got caught by someone equally careful watching for exactly the gap he had left, which meant whoever was running this had simply never expected anyone patient enough to look. He brought Reeve's logs to Captain Odette Finch, the battalion's judge advocate, a sharp, unflappable officer who had transferred in the previous year after 2 tours prosecuting fraud cases at a much larger command. Finch cross-referenced the timestamps against supply manifests within 2 days and found what the maintenance frequency alone couldn't prove. These convoys are moving equipment off the books, Finch told Ashcroft, laying the manifests across his desk. Night vision optics, vehicle parts, communications gear. Small enough quantities each time that nobody doing a routine inventory check would flag the gap, but consistent enough over 3 years that it adds up to a serious loss. Who has authorization to move equipment off manifest? Officially, nobody without your signature or Lieutenant Colonel Blaine's as your XO. Finch didn't soften the answer. I've cross-checked the authorization codes on 6 of these movements. All 6 carry Blaine's digital signature. Finch had transferred to Fort Callison the previous year after 2 tours prosecuting fraud cases at a much larger command, a posting she'd requested specifically because she'd grown tired of watching complex cases get diluted by commands too eager to resolve things quietly. She had a habit, colleagues said, of reading the signature block and the date stamp on any document before she read a single word of the body, on the theory that people lied carefully in the middle of a page and carelessly at the edges of it, and it was the edges of these manifests that had told her the most. I want to be honest with you about what we're facing, Finch told him. If this goes to a general court-martial, the defense is going to argue Blaine acted alone, without your knowledge, and that the discharge attempt was a rogue action by a single officer protecting a scheme you never sanctioned. That's actually the version most likely to hold up in court. It's also the version that leaves the man who profited most walking away clean. You mean Brackett? I mean whoever's name is on that shell address the leased storage yard traces back to. We don't have it yet. Blaine might. Finch let that sit a moment before continuing. I've prosecuted men like this before, Colonel. They almost never touch the theft themselves. They find somebody loyal, somebody with a reason to want to believe in what they're being asked to do, and they let that person carry every ounce of the actual risk. If we only convict Blaine, Brackett walks away and does the exact same thing at his next post within a year. I've seen it happen twice. Then we don't stop at Blaine. Agreed. But I need you to understand what that means practically. It means slower. It means Blaine stays in uniform and under suspicion longer than either of you will find comfortable. Because the version of this that actually reaches Brackett requires patience neither of us particularly wants to have right now. Ashcroft closed his eyes for a moment, weighing what it would cost to go after the man behind the money versus what it would cost to let a single subordinate absorb the entire fall. There wasn't really a choice in it, not one he could live with afterward. Then we get it from Blaine, whatever it takes to get him talking honestly. Ashcroft called Blaine into his office that evening. No IG investigator present this time, no witnesses, just the two men and 9 years of shared history sitting heavier in the room than either of them wanted to acknowledge out loud. I know about the convoys, Foster. Blaine didn't try to deny it this time. He sat down slowly, the fight visibly draining out of him, and when he finally spoke, his voice had none of the practiced steadiness from the hallway 2 days earlier. It wasn't for me, Blaine said. None of it ever went into my own pocket, Graham. I need you to believe that much. Then tell me where it went. There's a program, a private one, run by a contractor named Weldon Brackett, supporting veterans who fell through every official gap the system has, guys who got discharged with paperwork problems, guys the VA lost track of entirely. Brackett approached me 2 years ago, told me he could get real help to real people faster than any government channel ever would if he had access to surplus equipment nobody would miss. Blaine's hands were shaking now, faintly, the first physical crack Ashcroft had seen in him since this began. I believed him. I still want to believe I did something that mattered, even if I did it the wrong way. The pattern goes back 3 years, Foster, a full year before you're telling me you got involved. Blaine looked up at that, something like genuine surprise crossing his face for the first time all evening. There was somebody before me, a supply clerk, I think. Brackett mentioned once that his first contact on post had rotated out and left him with no way to move product until he found someone with real authorization. I never asked for a name. I didn't want one more thing I'd have to lie about if you ever asked me directly. You forged a psychiatric evaluation and my signature to get me out of this command before the readiness audit could catch any of it. Brackett told me the audit would expose the whole program and get real veterans cut off from help they were finally getting. I panicked. I thought if I could just buy enough time, if someone convinces you that breaking the law is the only way to do something good, Ashcroft said, cutting him off, quiet and absolutely level. That isn't a shortcut to justice, Foster. That's exactly how a man like Brackett keeps people like you from ever asking where the money actually goes. Blaine had no answer for that. Ashcroft watched him sit with it, the full weight of 2 years finally landing somewhere it could no longer be argued away. There's something else, Blaine said quietly, not meeting his eyes. It wasn't only the veterans, Graham. Brackett made me feel like I mattered to something for once, instead of being the man who spent 9 years standing one step behind you. That part isn't his fault. I let him use that too. Ashcroft absorbed that without softening. That doesn't make it less of a crime, Foster. It just means he read you accurately enough to know exactly which door to walk through. Finch pulled the program's paperwork the next day, a nonprofit registered under the name Continuum Veterans Outreach, filed 3 years earlier by Weldon Brackett personally. Its listed beneficiaries scattered across 4 counties. Only one name on the list lived close enough to visit in person. Harmon Steele, a retired staff sergeant, discharged 9 years earlier after a paperwork dispute had cost him most of his benefits. Ashcroft and Finch found him at a small rented house an hour off post, a wiry, weathered man who answered the door already skeptical of 2 people in uniform standing on his porch. I already told the last folks who came around, I don't need anybody's charity. We're not here on behalf of Continuum Veterans Outreach, Finch said. We're investigating them. Your name is on their beneficiary list, Mr. Steele. Steele's expression shifted, confusion replacing suspicion. I've never received a dime from any outfit by that name. Never heard of it until you just said it. Nothing, Ashcroft repeated. Not equipment, not funds, not so much as a phone call. Not one thing, Steele said. I fought for 2 years just to get my own discharge paperwork corrected. If somebody's been using my name to collect anything, I'd very much like to know who. He looked between the two of them, uniforms and clipboards and the careful neutrality officers wear when they're about to deliver news they haven't fully processed themselves. How bad is it? He invited them in, more out of a soldier's instinct to hear a briefing through to the end than genuine hospitality, and the three of them sat in a small kitchen that hadn't been updated since well before Steele's discharge. He told them about the 2 years of appeals, the lost paperwork, the benefits that had finally come through only after a veteran service officer had taken up his case pro bono, entirely unconnected to any private charity. I've had people show up at that door before promising help, Steele said. Most of them wanted something from me first, a signature, an interview, a photo for a newsletter. Nobody from Continuum anything ever showed up at all. I figured that was just one more name on one more list that forgot about me the second it was printed. It wasn't forgetting, Ashcroft said. It was never real to begin with. Steele absorbed that for a moment, his jaw tightening the same way Ashcroft's had over the forged discharge date. Somebody built a whole charity around men like me and never intended a single one of us to see a dollar of it. That's what we intend to prove, Finch said, and Steele walked them back out to the porch, standing there a moment longer than necessary as the two officers climbed into their vehicle, watching them go the way a man watches something he isn't yet ready to fully believe in. Ashcroft felt something settle into place with the cold finality of a lock turning. Whatever Blaine believed he was funding, the beneficiaries didn't exist outside a filing cabinet. The equipment wasn't reaching veterans at all. It was being sold quietly, through channels Brackett controlled entirely, and the entire charitable framing had been built for exactly one purpose, giving a loyal, guilt-ridden executive officer a reason good enough to keep breaking the law on Brackett's behalf. He used you, Ashcroft told Blaine that evening, laying out what Finch and Steele's testimony had confirmed. Every piece of equipment that left this post for 2 years went straight into Brackett's own resale network. There is no program. There never was. Blaine's face went the color of old ash. Steele never got anything. Nothing. Not $1, not one radio, not one night vision scope. Ashcroft watched the last of his old friend's justification collapse in real time. You didn't break the law to save anyone, Foster. You broke it to make a con man rich, and he let you believe it was noble enough that you'd forge a colonel's medical discharge rather than risk anyone asking questions. I need to make this right. Blaine's wife called Ashcroft that same week, her voice carefully controlled in the specific way of someone who had rehearsed the call several times before finally making it. She'd known nothing about the convoys or the discharge forgery, only that her husband had grown distant and sleepless over the last 2 years, a change she'd attributed, wrongly, to the ordinary strain of command. He kept telling me it was stress from the deployment tempo, she said. I believed him because I wanted to. I should have asked harder questions. That's not on you, Ashcroft told her. Brackett built this specifically so the people closest to Foster wouldn't see it coming. You weren't supposed to see it. That was the whole design. Doesn't make it hurt less. No, Ashcroft said. It doesn't. I wish I had a better answer for you than that, but I won't pretend one exists. You do, Ashcroft said, but making it right starts with helping us prove exactly what Brackett did on the record before he finds out you're the one loose thread he can't account for. Brackett found out faster than either of them expected. 2 days later, Rhett came home from the base community center visibly rattled, waiting until dinner to explain why. The security stopped me at the gate today, Rhett said. Said somebody reported an unauthorized transmitter matching my radio's serial number, broadcasting on a restricted frequency near the ammunition supply point. I've never even been near that building, Dad. Ashcroft set his fork down carefully, the specific stillness of a man controlling something much larger than his own hands. Did they confiscate the radio? Not yet. They logged a report and told me it's under review. Rhett's voice wavered, more confusion than fear, which somehow frightened Ashcroft more than open panic would have. I didn't do anything wrong. I know you didn't. Ashcroft reached across the table, steady now, deliberate. Somebody wants me distracted, and they've decided the fastest way to do that is to make you look like the problem instead of the reason we found any of this. Is this because of the logs I gave Specialist Reeve? It's because you did the right thing And somebody with something to lose doesn't like what that right thing is about to cost him. Ashcroft kept his voice level, the same register he used briefing soldiers before a difficult mission. None of this is because you did anything wrong. I need you to hold on to that no matter what happens next. I'm not scared for me, Rhett said. I just don't want it to be my fault if something happens because of what I found. Nothing that happens next is going to be your fault, Ashcroft said. You handed a stranger's logs to the right person because you thought it mattered. That was brave, not reckless, and I won't let anyone make you doubt the difference. He called Finch that same night, the two of them piecing together what neither wanted to say plainly in front of Rhett. A false security report, filed anonymously, timed precisely to the week Reeves' frequency logs had become part of the IG case file. Someone outside the base, with enough reach to know exactly which radio serial number to name, had decided Rhett's hobby made an efficient pressure point. Brackett doesn't have base access, Finch said, but he clearly has someone willing to make an anonymous call on his behalf. Then we stop giving him anything left to threaten, Ashcroft said. We move on him before he decides a phone call isn't enough. Finch had already identified the pattern's next scheduled window, a convoy movement logged for 3 nights out, routed toward a rail siding and storage yard 11 miles off post that Continuum Veterans Outreach had quietly leased under a shell address the previous year. It was, by every outward appearance, an ordinary equipment transfer. It was, in practice, the exact kind of handoff that had been draining the battalion's supply room for 3 years running. If we let this shipment go through under surveillance instead of stopping it at the gate, Finch said, we catch Brackett's people receiving stolen government property in the act, not just moving it. That's the difference between an administrative violation and a federal case that actually sticks. And Blaine. Blaine volunteers to run the convoy himself one last time, wired for audio, with your authorization and mine on record before he ever leaves the gate. Finch met Ashcroft's eyes without flinching. It has to be his choice, Colonel. I won't put a man on a wire who hasn't chosen it clean. He'll agree, Ashcroft said. I know him well enough to know that much hasn't changed, whatever else has. I need you to understand the risk plainly before I let you sign off on this, Finch said. If Brackett or his people suspect anything, Blaine is alone in that yard until CID closes the distance. 11 miles is not a short response time if something goes wrong in the first 30 seconds. Then we make sure nothing goes wrong in the first 30 seconds. That's the plan, Finch said. Plans survive first contact about as often as they don't. I'd rather you walk into this with your eyes open than with false confidence in how clean it's going to look. Blaine didn't hesitate when Ashcroft brought him the plan. I'll do it. I owe Steele that much, and I owe you considerably more. You'll have Reeve monitoring the frequency the entire time, Ashcroft said, and a CID unit staged 2 miles out, ready to move the second Finch gives the signal. Nothing about tonight happens without backup in position first. And Brackett, Finch added. Our informant inside the resale network says he never shows up to a handoff himself, but he calls in to check the crew personally every time, always from the same office off Route 9. If he calls tonight, we need him on that line long enough to say something we can use, and a second CID unit standing by, close enough to move on that office the second he's confirmed to be sitting in it. You want to hit 2 locations at once. I want to hit the location that actually has him in it, Finch said. The yard gets us his crew and the shipment. It was never going to get us Brackett standing in a floodlight. Men like him don't do their own lifting. The night of the handoff, Ashcroft arranged, quietly and without explanation, for Rhett to spend the evening at Reeves' off-post apartment rather than at home, a decision Rhett accepted without argument, sensing, in the particular way, children of career officers learn to sense these things, that his father needed him somewhere safe without needing to say so out loud. "Radio's staying here," Rhett said, setting it on Reeves' kitchen counter without being asked. "Figured that's part of the deal tonight." "Smart kid," Reeves said, and meant it. Reeve made him dinner that night, nothing elaborate, and the two of them sat at the kitchen table while Rhett worked through most of a plate of pasta without much appetite behind it. "Is my dad going to be okay?" "Your dad spent his whole career walking soldiers through worse nights than this one," Reeves said. "I've only known him a few weeks, and even I can tell you he doesn't go into anything without a plan for every way it could go wrong." "That's not the same as it actually going right." "No," Reeve admitted. "It's not. But it's the best odds anybody's going to give you tonight, and I'd rather sit here with you believing in good odds than bad ones." Rhett managed a small, unconvinced smile, and Reeve let the silence sit rather than filling it with anything less honest. Ashcroft sat alone in the unmarked vehicle for a few minutes before Finch and the CID team leader arrived, running through the plan one more time in his head, the same discipline he'd applied to every mission briefing of his career. He thought of Rhett, safe at Reeves' apartment with his radio powered down, and of Blaine, walking into that storage yard wearing a wire, and 9 years of friendship that had somehow curdled into something neither of them fully understood yet. He thought, too, of his wife, the particular calm she'd always brought to nights like this one, back when the danger had belonged to him alone and not to a 14-year-old kid who'd only ever wanted to listen to the world a little more closely than everyone else bothered to. The storage yard sat at the end of a gravel spur off the rail line, 3 container units and a loading dock, lit by a single floodlight that left most of the lot in shadow. Ashcroft watched from an unmarked vehicle with Finch and the CID team leader, close enough to see Blaine's truck pull in on schedule, headlights sweeping once across the containers before he cut the engine. 2 men were already waiting, one leaning against the nearest container, the other checking a clipboard under the floodlight. Neither wore a uniform. Blaine climbed out slowly, exactly as briefed, and approached with his hands visible. "Same manifest as last time," Blaine said. "Optics and vehicle parts, 4 crates." "You're running late," the man with the clipboard said. "Mr. Brackett doesn't love late." "Mr. Brackett isn't the one driving 11 miles off post in a vehicle that isn't supposed to exist on any log," Blaine said. "I got here, that's what matters." The second man circled toward the truck bed, and for a moment Ashcroft's chest went tight, watching him linger too long near the door, running a hand along the frame in a way that looked less like inspection and more like suspicion. "New nerves tonight, Blaine?" "No reason for nerves. I've done this a dozen times." "You look thinner than usual." The man's hand stopped near Blaine's jacket collar, close enough that Ashcroft, watching through the scope Finch held steady beside him, felt his own pulse spike. "A lot of guys start sweating right before they decide to grow a conscience." "The only thing I've decided," Blaine said, voice level despite everything, "is that I'd like to get these crates unloaded before somebody comes looking for a truck that's off its logged route." The man studied him a beat longer, then stepped back, apparently satisfied, and Ashcroft exhaled for what felt like the first time in a full minute. "Start the truck around," the clipboard man said. "We'll get these crates staged while you back up to the dock." Blaine moved to comply, and for a moment the operation looked, from Ashcroft's vantage point, exactly like a routine handoff, the kind that had apparently gone off without incident for 3 years running, while nobody with the authority to stop it ever thought to look closely enough. That was the moment the clipboard man's phone rang, loud and sudden, in the quiet lot. He glanced at the screen, then held it out toward Blaine instead of answering it himself. "He wants you personally tonight. Put it on speaker so I can hear you're not being stupid." Blaine took the phone, thumb steady despite everything, and thumbed the speaker on. "This is Blaine." "Foster." Brackett's voice came through thin and a little distant, unmistakably relaxed, a man checking in from somewhere comfortable rather than standing in gravel dust. "I wanted to hear this shipment confirmed personally, given how close your colonel's little investigation has gotten. Tell me you haven't said anything you shouldn't have to anyone." "I haven't said a word," Blaine said. "Good. Because if I find out otherwise, it won't just be your career that ends over this." Brackett's voice stayed pleasant, almost warm, which made the threat underneath it land harder than shouting would have. "I know exactly where your commanding officer's son spends his afternoons. I'd hate for that fact to matter more than it already has." Finch's hand tightened on Ashcroft's arm, a silent order to hold position, and Ashcroft forced himself to stay still, even as every instinct screamed to move. The wire on Blaine's collar was still transmitting. Every word coming through that speaker was being recorded in real time, and in the front seat, Finch was already keying her own radio, low and clipped, relaying 3 words to a second unit parked 3 blocks from an office off Route 9. "He's confirmed. Go." "You're not touching his son," Blaine said into the phone, and for the first time all night, something other than fear moved through his voice. "That was never part of what I agreed to. Not with him. Not with anyone. You don't get to decide the terms anymore, Foster. You gave that up 2 years ago. Then I'm taking it back right now." Blaine raised his voice, clear and deliberate, aimed at the phone rather than the men in front of him. "This is Lieutenant Colonel Foster Blaine. Everything you just said over this line is on record." There was a beat of dead air. Then the line went silent, not hung up carefully, but dropped. Fast, the sound of a man realizing exactly what he'd just said into a phone he no longer controlled. Floodlights from 3 directions snapped on at the yard at almost the same instant, CID agents moving in fast from the tree line. The clipboard man dropped the phone in the gravel and bolted toward the containers instead of surrendering, and for a few tense seconds, it looked like he might disappear into the gap between 2 units before an agent cut the angle off and brought him down. His partner dropped his own hands to his sides and raised them without needing to be told twice, the fight draining out of the operation in the space of a few seconds. Ashcroft's radio crackled half a minute later. The second unit's voice clipped and steady. "Office secured. Brackett's in custody. He was still holding the phone when we came through the door." Ashcroft let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding since the phone first rang. He never even had to set foot in the yard to hang himself. All he had to do was talk. "That's usually how it goes with men like him," Finch said. "They build the whole operation so their own hands stay clean. They just forget the line stays open the same way for everyone on it." Blaine stood apart from it all, hands still slightly shaking, staring at the phone lying dark in the gravel where the clipboard man had dropped it. And when Ashcroft crossed the lot to stand beside him, Blaine didn't try to explain himself again. He simply said the only thing left worth saying. "I'm sorry, Graham, for all of it." "I know," Ashcroft said. "Sorry doesn't undo what you signed my name to. But it's a start you actually had to choose instead of one I had to drag out of you, and that's going to matter more than you think it does right now." Weldon Brackett was charged within the week with theft of government property, wire fraud, and making a criminal threat against a minor, the recorded phone call and his own arrest with the handset still in his hand, leaving his defense attorneys almost nothing to argue around. Federal investigators working from Finch's manifests traced the resale network to buyers in 2 other states, unraveling a supply chain Brackett had spent years building on the backs of men who genuinely believed they were helping someone. 2 other executive officers at different posts came forward once Brackett's arrest made regional news, each describing a version of the same pitch Blaine had once believed, a private program promising to reach veterans the official system had failed, always requiring just enough surplus equipment to seem plausible, never quite enough to trigger an audit on its own. Neither of the other officers had gone as far as Blaine, but both admitted under oath to looking the other way on inventory discrepancies they should have reported. Brackett's operation, it turned out, hadn't been built around one loyal officer's guilt. It had been built to find one at every post, patient enough to cultivate. He wasn't unlucky enough to run into Foster specifically, Finch told Ashcroft after the second officer's statement came in. He was patient enough to eventually find someone exactly like him at some post sooner or later. Foster just happened to be the one whose colonel refused to sign the paperwork that would have kept it quiet. Foster Blaine faced a court-martial for forgery, larceny of government property, and conduct unbecoming an officer, exactly as Ashcroft had warned him he would. His cooperation, the wire, the testimony, the full account he gave without waiting to be asked twice, was entered into the record and weighed accordingly. He was convicted, stripped of rank, and sentenced to confinement, a term that would end his military career entirely and one he accepted without appeal. Ashcroft testified at the sentencing hearing, not as a character witness in the traditional sense, but to make certain the court understood the full shape of what had happened, the 9 years of trust that had made the forgery possible in the first place, and the 2 years of manipulation that had turned a decorated officer into a man willing to sign someone else's name to a lie. He didn't ask for leniency. He asked only that the record reflect accurately who had built the scheme and who had been used by it, a distinction he believed mattered, even if it didn't change the sentence. "I'm not asking the court to excuse what he did," Ashcroft told the panel. "I'm asking the court to understand that Weldon Brackett built a machine specifically designed to make good men do bad things and call it conscience. Lieutenant Colonel Blaine walked into that machine believing he was helping veterans this country failed. He deserves to be held accountable for what he actually did, not for the version of himself Brackett convinced him he was." "I keep thinking about what you said," Blaine told Ashcroft, the last time they spoke before the sentencing, "about how a man like Brackett keeps people from asking where the money goes. I had 2 years to ask. I never once did." "You're asking now," Ashcroft said. "It's not enough to undo it. It's enough to mean something. That's the only kind of redemption anyone actually gets, Foster. Not a clean slate, just a truer account of what happened, told by the person who finally stopped running from it. Will you tell Red I'm sorry for the report against him, for all of it, but especially that?" "I already have," Ashcroft said. He wanted you to know he doesn't hate you. He said it was easier to be angry at Brackett because Brackett never once pretended to care about him in the first place. Blaine's composure finally broke at that. Quiet and unguarded, in a way 9 years of shared command had never once allowed Ashcroft to witness before. He didn't say anything else. He didn't need to, and Ashcroft, for the first time since the discharge folder had landed on his desk, let himself grieve for the friend he had lost inside the man he was walking away from. The IG's investigation formally cleared Ashcroft of any wrongdoing within the month, the forged discharge voided in its entirety, his personnel file corrected, and, for the first time in 5 years, forwarded up the chain without a single note of quiet concern attached to it. The division chief of staff who had once suggested a quieter staff assignment called Ashcroft personally to acknowledge, in the careful, understated language senior officers use when they mean considerably more than the words themselves convey, that he had misjudged the situation. "I want you to know the board will be looking at your file with fresh eyes this cycle," the chief of staff said. "You've more than earned that." "I earned it 5 years ago, too," Ashcroft said, not unkindly, just factually. "I appreciate the call, sir." He hung up and sat with the conversation a while, aware that an apology delivered 5 years late was still, in its own limited way, better than one that never arrived at all, even if it didn't fully account for the years spent quietly proving himself to people who should never have needed convincing. The promotion board that convened that spring considered him seriously for the first time since his wife's death, not because anyone owed him sympathy, but because the record finally showed exactly what it should have shown all along. Harmon Steele received at last real support, not from a fabricated charity, but from a fund Finch and Reeve built together out of the wreckage of Brackett's fraud, seeded partly by restitution and partly by donations from soldiers across the battalion who'd heard exactly what Steele had been denied for 9 years. Finch named it plainly, the Steele Veterans Support Fund, refusing every suggestion that it be branded with something softer or more marketable, insisting the point was to attach a real name to real help so no one could ever again hide behind a fabricated one. The fund's first review board included 2 other veterans Finch's investigation had turned up during a discovery, men whose names had also appeared on Continuum Veterans Outreach's beneficiary rolls without ever receiving so much as a phone call. One of them, a former supply sergeant who'd lost most of a leg in a training accident years earlier, told Finch during the intake interview that he'd stopped trusting any organization with the word veterans in its name after Continuum's letterhead showed up in his mailbox promising help that never came. "Well, we can't undo that," Finch told him. "We can only be better than the thing that made you stop believing anyone would." "That's a fair answer," he said. "More honest than most I've gotten." "I've found honest answers hold up a lot longer than comfortable ones," Finch said. "Comfortable ones are what got you 9 years of nothing in the first place." He nodded slowly, not quite convinced yet, and Finch didn't push him to be. Trust, she'd learned across 2 tours of fraud prosecutions, was never rebuilt by a single conversation. It was rebuilt the same way it had been broken, one verified promise at a time, for as long as it took. Steele visited the post that fall for the fund's first formal presentation, standing a little straighter than he had on his porch the day Ashcroft and Finch first knocked on his door. 9 years I figured nobody in a uniform would ever come looking to make it right, Steele told the small crowd gathered for the ceremony. Turned out I just hadn't met the right ones yet. Specialist Callan Reeve was recommended for an early promotion board, the frequency logs that had cracked the case now taught, unofficially, as a case study in the communications school Reeve had graduated from barely a year earlier. The battalion sergeant major who'd once waved off Reeve's original report as equipment noise pulled them aside after the promotion recommendation was announced. "I owe you an apology," the sergeant major said. "I told you it was nothing. Should have listened the first time instead of the third." "You listened eventually," Reeve said. "That's more than a lot of people manage." "Still should have been the first time," the sergeant major said. "I've been doing this long enough to know better than to wave off a junior soldier just because the report didn't come wrapped the way I expected it to. For what it's worth, I wasn't trying to prove anyone wrong. I just couldn't stop thinking about it." "That's usually how the good catches happen," the sergeant major said. "Not from somebody trying to be right, from somebody who just can't let a thing go once it's bothering them." The sergeant major nodded once, an acknowledgement that carried more weight coming from a man who rarely admitted fault to anyone, junior or senior, and walked off without further ceremony, which struck Reeve as exactly the kind of apology that meant it. Reeve never let the recognition go to their head, telling anyone who asked that the credit belonged just as much to a 14-year-old with a homemade antenna who'd never stopped listening carefully to a signal everyone else had written off as noise. Ashcroft visited his wife's grave the weekend after the promotion board results came in, something he did quietly and without telling Rhett beforehand, a habit that predated everything Brackett and Blaine had put them through. He stood there longer than usual that particular Sunday, turning the promotion notification over in his coat pocket like it was something fragile. "You'd have told me not to let the whispers get to me," he said to no one who could answer. "You always did see through them faster than I did." He didn't cry. He rarely did anymore, not because the grief had faded, but because it had settled into something quieter, a weight he'd learned to carry rather than a wound that still bled openly. He drove home that evening and found Rhett on the porch step, waiting without quite admitting he'd been waiting. "You went to see Mom." "I did. Did you tell her about Colonel Blaine and the promotion?" "All of it," Ashcroft said, sitting down beside him. She'd have had opinions about both. Rhett leaned his head against his father's shoulder, an unguarded gesture he'd mostly outgrown over the last couple of years, and neither of them said anything else for a while, the porch light drawing the first moths of the evening in slow, aimless circles above them. Rhett got his radio back within days, the false security report formally struck from his record once CID confirmed it had originated from a number tied to one of Brackett's associates. He rebuilt the antenna that weekend, adjusting the angle by inches, the way he did every few months, chasing some marginal improvement only he could hear the difference in. Weeks later, on an ordinary evening, Ashcroft found him in the carport, headset on, turning the dial slowly through a band that had given him nothing but static for most of the summer while the investigation ran its course. Ashcroft leaned against the doorframe in no hurry, content just to watch his son work through the frequencies with the same patience Reeve had once described noticing in him. A voice broke through, clear for the first time in months, a distant operator somewhere out past the county line, reading off a call sign. "Got one," Rhett said, grinning up at his father. "Clean signal, no static at all." Ashcroft sat down beside him on the carport step, listening to his son answer back, steady and sure of himself, and thought that there were worse ways to measure whether something broken had finally been set right than by how clearly it came through on the other end. "You want to turn?" Rhett asked, holding the headset out. Ashcroft took it, settled it over one ear, and listened to the distant operator's voice come through clean and unbroken, no static left to strain against at all, the kind of signal that took patience and a steady hand to ever find in the first place.